Daybreak came and went. At the sound of distant shots, Rhett's mother rushed to the withdrawing room window, peering with myopic, blinking intensity. "Probably market hunters," Rhett's brother Julian announced. "Shooting passenger pigeons." Dr. Ward's wife, Eulalie, nodded in agreement. Charlotte Fisher's warm hand found Rosemary's cold one and squeezed it hard. Color flushing her ashen cheeks, Elizabeth Butler rang for a servant. "We will take refreshment." Rosemary closed her eyes so tightly, red spots flashed behind her eyelids as she prayed silently. "Please, God, keep my brother safe. Please, God, make Rhett safe." Quiet as church mice, concealed behind a love seat's curving arm, Rosemary and Charlotte were in the farthest corner of the big, chilly room. Constance Venable Fisher cleared her throat to issue an opinion. "Langston has chosen a singularly unfortunate time to do his accounts." Mrs. Fisher's judgmental nod bored through the withdrawing room door, marched down the hall, down the grand staircase, through the public parlor into Langston Butler's office. Julian replied, "Father is a man of regular habits. Saturday mornings he does accounts." Seated on the hard, upright chair she had taken as the spinsters do, Miss Juliet Ravenel said, "Sometimes men conceal their fears by punctiliousness. Perhaps Mr. Butler—" "Nonsense," Constance Fisher pronounced. "Langston Butler is stubborn as a root hog." Uncle Solomon, Broughton's houseman, brought tea and a platter heaped with the ginger cookies Cook usually baked only during race week. When Mrs. Butler asked for sherry, Uncle Solomon replied, "But, missus, it ain't hardly day. Sun just coming up." "We will take sherry," Mrs. Butler insisted. After Solomon shut the door too noisily, she said, "As Mr. Butler says, Negroes take advantage of their master's kindness. Everyone recalls how the Butlers kept slavery in the United States Constitution." Miss Ravenel refreshed a boast with which everyone present was all too familiar. Mrs. Butler took her bait. "Why, yes, my husband's beloved Uncle Middleton headed the South Carolina delegation." "Yes, dear," Constance Fisher said, not unkindly. "We know all that. Rhett is nothing like Middleton. Rhett favors his grandfather, Louis Valentine." Elizabeth Butler put a hand to her mouth. "We mustn't speak of him. Langston never mentions his father's name." "Dear me, why ever not?" Constance Fisher said cheerfully. "America is a new nation. Blood money is scrubbed clean in a generation." Broughton had been an unprofitable indigo plantation that couldn't provide for the brothers who'd inherited it. Louis Valentine Butler took himself off to New Orleans and a lifelong association with buccaneer Jean Lafitte, while Middleton Butler entered the slave trade. Fortunes were made importing Africans, but Middleton's captains paid too much for sickly specimens, and his Negroes who survived the Middle Passage were discounted at the sales. Middleton quit the business when Charleston's council ordered him to dump dead Negroes farther out to sea. Corpses were washing ashore at White Point, where Charleston's gentry took Sabbath promenades. Since Middleton Butler didn't choose sides until the American Revolution was safely won, he acquired 300 Loyalist acres forfeited to patriots. As a delegate to the Philadelphia Convention, Middleton Butler did keep slavery in the newly minted Constitution. In 1810, Louis Valentine Butler captured the Mercado, a Spanish silver ship, off Tampico, and bought 1,000 acres of prime rice land for Broughton. Langston Butler, Louis Valentine's son, quarreled fiercely with his father and moved in with his bachelor uncle, Middleton. Louis Valentine bought 2,000 more acres. The purchase money came from prizes taken off the Texas coast. Although Louis Valentine swore they'd been Spanish and Mexican ships, rumor persisted they'd been flying the American flag. Successive Broughton overseers were hard-pressed to support Middleton's extravagant Charleston establishment. One bright morning in 1825, Louis Valentine Butler sailed from Galveston in the pride of Charleston, and was never seen again. Later that year, Middleton Butler's creditors attended that gentleman's funeral, paying homage to an American patriot while seeking their due from Langston Butler, the Butler heir. Langston Butler sold 200 slaves to satisfy creditors' claims and married 15-year-old Elizabeth Kershaw. Miss Elizabeth was notable for her piety and plain features. When Elizabeth Butler's firstborn, Rhett Kershaw Butler, emerged into the world, the infant had his caul clenched in his fist, a circumstance Broughton's conjure-men said was an unusual, powerful omen. Whether for good or ill, they couldn't say. Although the African slave trade had been outlawed 2 decades before, slave ships sometimes slipped into Charleston Harbor, and Langston Butler was a willing buyer of Angolans, Coromantes, Gambians, and Ibos, coastal Africans resistant to fevers and familiar with rice production. He completed Broughton Plantation with 2,000 acres from Colonel Ravenel, who was too despondent after his wife's death to drive a hard bargain. Rhett's father founded the Ashley River Agricultural Society. After experimenting with rice varieties, Langston selected Soonchurcher Putty, an African variety that winnowed well and produced a plump grain. When Wade Hampton invited Langston to run for the Carolina legislature, Langston entered the Low Country's richest, most exclusive men's club. The morning of Rhett's duel, Langston's younger son, Julian, drank tea while the ladies took sherry. When Solomon failed to brim her glass, Constance Fisher tapped it impatiently. From behind the sheltering love seat, Charlotte Fisher smelled ginger cookies, a warm tingling in the back of her nose. With a sigh, Charlotte set her wants aside. How could she be thinking of ginger cookies when Rosemary's brother might be wounded or dead? Charlotte Fisher had a thoroughgoing respect for grown-up wisdom. Grown-ups were grown-ups, after all. But Charlotte had concluded they were wrong about Rhett Butler. "Belle Watling is pretty," the unpretty Miss Ravenel remarked, "for a rustic." Elizabeth Butler shook her head. That girl has sorely tried her father's patience. When Langston was away, Elizabeth Butler joined the overseer's family for Sunday prayers. Elizabeth was vaguely comforted by the simple farmhouse where she'd once had her hopes, giddy newlywed hopes, for a happy life. Isaiah Watling's fierce, unbending Christianity consoled her. "The field of honor, it's a lovely meadow beside the river. The oaks are dripping with Spanish moss. When I married, I dreamed Langston and I might picnic there one day. We would have such fine picnics." Mrs. Butler dropped her eyes. "How I ramble on. Pray forgive me." She glanced at the tall clock upon whose serene face a gilt quarter moon was slowly plunging into an enameled sea. She rang Uncle Solomon again. Had he wound the clock recently, and if so, had he changed the hands? "No, missus." Solomon licked his lips. "I winds the clock Sundays. You want it winded now?" She dismissed him with a dispirited wave. "An apology," Mrs. Butler said. "No one expects Rhett to marry the girl." "Excellent notion. An apology," Miss Ravenel applauded. "My brother would never apologize." Rosemary's protests startled her elders, who had forgotten the little girls. "Shad Watling is a bully and a liar. Rhett would never apologize to Shad Watling." Though Rosemary's cheeks flushed, she wouldn't recant, not one word. When sensible Charlotte squeezed her friend's ankle, Rosemary shoved her hand away. "Rhett never liked Charleston." Mrs. Butler's eyes roved. "Rhett said the only difference between alligators and Charlestonians was that alligators showed their teeth before they bit." "Rhett favors his grandfather," Constance Fisher repeated. "That raven hair, those laughing black eyes." Her voice traveled back in time. "Mercy, how Louis Valentine could dance." "Why couldn't that girl have gone away?" Elizabeth Butler cried. "She has connections in Missouri." Miss Ravenel averred there were many bastards in Missouri. Perhaps there were even more bastards in Missouri than in Texas. Julian Butler compared his watch with the tall clock and retarded the clock. "We won't hear the shots. Too distant." His mother gasped. "Julian," Constance Fisher said, "your brother may be a rogue, but you are a dunce." Julian shrugged. "Rhett's latest escapade has upset our household. All the servants wear long faces." Thinking cook had prepared these cookies for honored guests, Julian afforded them a nod. "I complimented her." "Oh, no, Master Julian. I bakes 'em for Master Rhett, after he done fightin'." Charlotte whispered, "Rosemary, please don't say any more. We must be perfect possums." Charlotte added wistfully, "I would so like a ginger cookie." The big clock ticked. Julian cleared his throat. "Mrs. Ward, I'm less familiar with Savannah's first families than I should be. You were a Robillard, I believe." Miss Ravenel remembered some gossip. "Wasn't some Robillard on the brink of consummating an unfortunate alliance with a cousin, was it?" "Dear cousin Philippe. My sister Ellen thought Philippe was magnificent," Eulalie giggled. By now she had her third glass of sherry. "I suppose a lion is magnificent, until he eats you." Miss Ravenel recalled details. "Didn't the Robillards exile cousin Philippe and marry the girl off to an Irish storekeeper?" Eulalie tried to bolster family dignity. "My sister Ellen married a successful businessman. She and Mr. Gerald O'Hara have a cotton plantation near Jonesboro. Terra, it is called." She sniffed. "After his family estate in Ireland, I presume." "Jonesboro would be in Georgia?" Miss Ravenel stifled her yawn. "Indeed. Ellen writes that her daughter Scarlett is a Robillard through and through." "Scarlett! What a curious name. Scarlett O'Hara. Those Irish, dear me." Hands clasped behind his back, Julian said, "It'll be over now." Elizabeth Butler's voice chimed with false hope. "Rhett and Shad will have made amends and galloped off to Mr. Turner's tavern." Constance Fisher said, "Julian, if your father has finished his accounts, might he condescend to join us?" "Langston Butler's work is never done," Julian intoned. 14,000 acres, 350 Negroes, 60 horses, including 5 of the finest thoroughbreds, but only 2 sons, Constance Fisher snapped, "one of whom may be dying of a bullet wound." Elizabeth Butler put her hand to her mouth. "Rhett is at Mr. Turner's tavern," she whispered. "He must be." When Rosemary heard the hoofbeats, she ran to the window, flinging it open wide so damp air rushed into the house. On tiptoes, the child pushed her torso outside. "It's Tecumseh!" she cried. "I'd know his gallop anywhere. Oh, listen, Mama! Can't you hear? Rhett's in the lane! It is him! It's Tecumseh!" The child bolted from the room, hurtled pell-mell down the broad staircase, past her father's office, and outside onto the oyster shell drive, where her brother was reining in his lathered horse. A grinning Uncle Solomon took Tecumseh's bridle. "I gratified you home, Master Rhett," Uncle Solomon said. "All us coloreds gratified." The young man slid off his horse and scooped his sister into the air, squeezing her so fiercely it took her breath. "I'm sorry I frightened you, little one. I wouldn't have you frightened for the world." "Rhett, you're hurt." His left sleeve was empty. His arm hung inside his black frock coat. "The ball didn't touch bone. It's gusty beside the river at sunrise. Watling didn't allow for gusts." "Oh, Rhett, I was so afraid. What would I do if I lost you?" "You haven't lost me, child. Only the good die young." He set his sister at arm's length, as if stamping her forever on his memory. His black eyes were so sad. "Come with me, Rosemary," he said. And for one exalted instant, the child misunderstood. For a few seconds, Rosemary thought she and Rhett would flee this joyless house, that she'd wave farewell from Tecumseh's back as brother and sister flew away. She followed her brother onto the long, empty piazza in front of the house. Rhett put his good arm around his sister's thin shoulder and turned her so they overlooked their family's world. On the patchwork of sunlit rectangular rice fields, gangs were spreading marl, chanting as they worked. Though the words were inaudible, the tone was sweet and sorrowing. The Ashley River's tidal arc outlined Broughton's main trunk. On that trunk, a horseman galloped toward the east field and Isaiah Watling. "Bad news rides the swiftest horse," Red said quietly. After a pause, he added, "I shan't ever forget how beautiful this is." Is Shad Watling?" "Yes," Red said. "Are you sad?" Rosemary asked. "He was a bully. You needn't be sad." Rhett smiled. "What a wonder you are."